This is Chthonia, the world of the dark feminine. Hello, this is Breach Burke. Before we get into this week's podcast, I would like to thank my patrons personally. Gwyn K., Politi, Caitlin N., John H., Tanya T., Veronica S., Gabby, Helen M., Ruth S., Sunny H., Scott K., JRM, Phil J., Susie G., Eldritch Priest, and B. Lupita. I really appreciate those of you who have joined recently and who have stuck with me over these years. Our community is small, and there is so much I would like to do in terms of providing courses, conversation on the dark feminine, and extra content, so please consider joining at patreon.com/Chthonia. Now on to the podcast. Hello and welcome to Chthonia, the podcast dealing with the dark feminine. I'm your host, Breach Burke. Now this week, I made a decision. I had an initial podcast schedule that I had put together that included, I had a few other more obscure feminine figures that I listed for the end of September and on through probably early October. But as I started to go down the rabbit hole of this particular figure, I decided it would be good to deal with her in connection with at least two other figures over the next couple of episodes. So, I'm dealing today with the goddess known as Astarte. Astarte is worshipped a lot by, she seems to have a more modern cult following, and she is one of those goddesses from the ancient Mesopotamian regions, and initially Phoenicia, that is connected to not only love, but also to war. She's actually considered to be, officially she's said to be the goddess of love, sex, war, and hunting. And she's not mentioned in too many places. We are going to discuss the places where she is talked about in the Baal Cycle in particular, from this particular region. But she still seems to, her name of course survives. There are mentions of her in the Bible, and often in a negative way, as you might imagine. And she also has a popularity that came about in Egypt as well, where she became the wife of the storm god Set. We've talked about in the podcast all of the different wives of Set. I mean, it seems like there's been a myriad of female figures that have been connected to Set in some way. But Astarte certainly at later times was one of them. So what I want to do is talk a little bit, my sort of agenda for today, if you will, is I want to talk a bit about who she is. I want to talk a little bit about the Canaanite pantheon, or her relevance to the Canaanite pantheon. I want to talk about the etymology of her name, what kind of iconography she has, a little bit the Baal Cycle stories, and also a little bit about Canaanite religion, sort of a little bit of a backdrop on that, her presence in the Bible, and her relationship to the other war goddesses that as we'll see, she's associated with. And, well, I should say war and love goddesses that she's associated with, specifically Inanna and Ishtar. And also just in general, we want to talk at the end a little bit about the theme of love goddesses as war goddesses, okay? We look at them, we tend to separate those in our mind, especially in the kinds of contexts that we have since post-Christianity, certainly. But it's very, very interesting to see when you have these very ancient deities who are from the era of, we're talking 2000s BCE, or even older than that, when we had the first epics, when we had Gilgamesh, when we had the Enuma Elish and Ugartic texts that we have from the Hittites and from these other regions. These are the deities who are talked about, and it gives us an interesting window into how the feminine is viewed at that time, how this is dealt with. So let's begin. Who is she? Now, I'm reading this from the World History Encyclopedia, which I think is good. The Wikipedia page, by the way, is actually quite good for Astarte. I mean, it's really, whoever edited that, loaded it up with source material. So that is a good, comprehensive way to look at the way Astarte is represented across different cultures. But let's just start here. She's the Canaanite or Phoenician goddess of love. I think originally Phoenician, adopted by the Canaanites. The love, sex, and war and hunting. Automatically right here. If we start thinking of our automatic associations with Greek and Roman pantheons, we're thinking almost like Aphrodite, Venus, plus almost a Diana type figure. in terms of associations, and perhaps even Athena to some degree. It's almost like all these different aspects of femininity. And she developed they say she developed from the Mesopotamian deity Inanna or Ishtar. Okay, and actually there is an etymological connection. She's usually associated with the storm god Baal, but seems to have been much more popular than Baal, apparently, which is interesting given what the literature has. She's traveled to Egypt through trade, where she was adopted as a war deity and a consort of Set. So it's interesting. They're saying she was associated with war in the Levant prior to her arrival in Egypt, but stories concerning her usually emphasize her skill in hunting and aspects of her relationship with Baal and the god El. Now, El, we've talked a bit about Yahweh in other podcasts that are connected to some of these ancient deities. And El is really, when you read the translations of the Bible, the Old Testament, particularly if you look at the Interpreter's Bible, which actually gives you all of the different ones, like the Greek, the Aramaic, the Hebrew, it gives you all these different translations. We will frequently see Yahweh referred to as El. So, and at some point there's a break off or a separation between the two. But you will see some of these Canaanite deities bound up with the mythology, the early mythology of Yahweh. She's depicted with horses and chariots after her arrival in Egypt, and as a beautiful naked woman, sometimes with wings or horns, as she was in the Canaanite Phoenician religions, and who also associate her with the dove, the bee, and the lion. And by the way, the dove association is very interesting because that is connected to later images of the Holy Spirit, or the Paraclete, as it's referred to, descends like a dove. That's the image that you see, and there is a connection there to. Again, some people say it's Ishtar, some say it's Inanna, some say it's Astarte, but Astarte definitely was in play, certainly in the Old Testament type religion. Her name and her origins. Okay, Astarte is the Greek form of the Canaanite. I think it's pronounced Athart or Atart, and the Phoenician Ashtart, both which derive from the Akkadian Astartu, referencing the goddess Ishtar. Ishtar developing from the Sumerian goddess Inanna, who is attested to be in writing from the 4th millennium BCE, but whose worship is much older. So yeah, we are talking really, really old, religion, at least as far as what's recorded. This is definitely pre anything that we think of really as biblical. The Bible's actually not that old in terms of the texture, the texts and the scriptures. We're only talking, well, the Bible as written down. There are texts that are probably, again, oral tradition's probably older, but we don't really see those texts until maybe around the time that you're starting to see writing in Greece and Rome, like maybe the 900s, the 800s. You might see some of the earliest stuff. Most of things written down during the Babylonian captivity, which is around the 500s-ish BCE. So it's quite late. I talk about this a lot with flood narratives in particular, because those are the ones people talk about. The Noah story. I'm like, well, the Noah story is just copied from one that was was written down 1,500 years before that. So it's not there's a lot of this crossover here. Inanna was a goddess of love, sexuality, sensuality, fertility, and war, and these attributes later characterized Ishtar. So the stories that we have connected with her in the Ugaritic texts. She says she's first mentioned in the text from the ancient city of Ugarit, which is modern-day Ras Shamra in Syria, dating back to the mid-14th to late 13th centuries BCE, specifically the Baal Cycle and something titled El's Drinking Party. The Baal Cycle is not a single work, but a collection of tales concerning Baal's war with the sea god Yam and his victory over death and ascent as king of the gods. Yam, that's an interesting name because I'm thinking of Lord Yama in Hinduism. It's one of those questions. Again, linguists might jump on me and say, no, there's probably no connection between the names. And maybe there isn't. I don't know. But I just find the similarity there interesting. Okay. So Baal is the god of storms, rain, and war, who's also associated with fertility and good harvests, and was one of the more popular gods of the Canaanite pantheon. His power position as prince, son of Lord El, made him a natural choice as El's successor. The Baal cycle opens, however, with Baal's disappointment at El's decision to choose Yam as the new king instead of himself. Yeah, Yam is really a sea deity, but I associate sea stuff with the underworld. So, Once Yam is given the kingship, though, he enslaves his fellow gods who cry out to El's consort Asherah. Okay, Asherah's a little different. She's one of almost a trinity, part of one of this trinity that includes Astarte, Asherah, and Anat. So, and the other two are the ones we are going to talk about over the next couple of weeks. So there's a story about Asherah and how Yam wants to possess Asherah and so forth. It says, when Asherah returns to the council of the gods with this news, her acceptance of Yam's condition, all gratefully accept her sacrifice on their part, except Baal, who swears that he will kill Yam. When Yam sends emissaries asking the council to surrender Baal to him, the messengers behave arrogantly, and he moves to attack them, but is restrained by Anat and Astarte. And it said that the Coogan and Smith translation says, then Prince Baal was shaken, in his hand a striker, in his left hand a slayer. Anat seizes, his left hand Astarte seizes. So it says the text is badly damaged at this point, but the goddesses seem to warn him against killing messengers who are only obeying orders. El also ignores the bad behavior of the emissaries and promises Baal will be delivered and will come bearing gifts. At this point, the god of crafts, Kotar Wakasis, I think that's how that's said, forges two mighty clubs for Baal that will defeat Yam. Baal meets Yam in single combat, defeats him, and throws him back into the sea, afterwards assuming the kingship. Following the sequence, Mot, the god of death, rises in rebellion against Baal and swallows him, or thinks he does, as Baal has actually gone into hiding and sent a double in his place. Since he is a fertility god, his absence brings drought and famine. So that's interesting. It's almost like, Baal, and then you have this motif here. I'm just going to point out the mythological motif of being swallowed, the being in the belly of the beast, so to speak. So, and this almost is reminiscent of the Persephone story, in which she is abducted into the underworld, and when she does, then her mother in her grief brings drought and famine. Well, really, we think about it as winter at this point. And it's the death god, of course, in this case. So this is another underworld image about the idea of death taking place around the earth. It would seem natural at this point that his consort Astarte would play a significant role in avenging him, but instead it's his sister Anat who kills Mot, cuts him into pieces, and hurls him throughout the land. Afterwards, Baal reveals himself and resumes his reign, subdues Mot, who is as an immortal god has returned to life, and the story ends. Yeah, so it's interesting. So why? Yeah, so the question becomes here: Astarte, she's this goddess that's associated with love. She's associated with hunting. There's a little bit of an explanation here, trying to understand why, if she is his consort and if she is a war goddess, why first of all is she restraining him from battle? Although there may be this idea about the correctness of the use of force with her restraining Baal. But you also have to wonder about what, why she seems to be playing a much more passive role, and it's her sister who actually is the one who defends Baal rather than her. Coogan and Smith were the ones who did the translation. They suggest that this is an expression of Ugarit's patriarchal society, which informed its theology. It says, there's no doubt that Ugaritic patriarchy informed the religious texts, but this does not explain why Asherah and Anat are given central roles, while a popular goddess like Astarte only appears in the scene where she helps restrain Baal, and then later when she votes with the other gods that Baal should have his own palace. So this is the only place that she is mentioned as far as the Baal text. Although some people say that early scholarship tried to solve this problem by saying Astarte and Anat were conflated, so it is in fact Astarte who takes on the role of Avenger. However, this claim has been dismissed, as it's clear the two goddesses are distinct, and there's no evidence they were ever conflated. In the myth of El's drinking party, Anat and Astarte prepare the feast, go hunting together, and help El cure his hangover afterwards. And the theory that they're presenting here is that Anat is simply the more active agent of the two, choosing to take on the task herself, while Astarte may have been thought to inspire the action. So she may be more of the... And as a goddess of desire, that makes some sense, because when we think about the way that desire appears in mythology, like if we think about the primal erotic impulse in Greek myth, for example. And I keep turning back to this because this is where most of the texts are. We don't necessarily... we do have a fair amount of texts from the Babylonian and the Sumerian, but there's not necessarily a completeness on some of these points as we see it in later pantheons that are still ancient, that are still from the days of early writing. But we see this kind of idea, of eros, or the erotic. as primal eros is not, which should not, by the way, be conflated with the later eros in Greek mythology, where he's the son of Aphrodite. The primal eros is different. And primal eros, if you look at the primal deities to come out of chaos, you have Tartarus, you have Erebus, you have Nyx, you have, what was the other one? I mean, obviously you have Gaia, who comes out of this as well, and then you have Eros. So what you have here is this void, this darkness. You have Nyx, which is night. You have Erebus, which is gloom, basically. You have Tartarus, which is the depths. And out of these, but there's desire. So desire at this point is an idea of manifestation. And it doesn't particularly say where Eros is masculine or feminine at this point. The implication is almost that it's masculine, primordial Eros, or maybe it's just completely sexless at that point. But it's this idea of drive to create something out of void. So we have this idea. So the idea that you have a goddess like Astarte who might serve that kind of that initial inspiring kind of thing. Thinking again in tarot imagery, I think of the magician and the high priestess. And some people think the high priestess belongs with the Hierophant, but if you look at her with respect to the magician, they represent this kind of masculine and feminine force that has to do with potential and manifestation. If you follow Thelemic thinking in the Book of the Law, Crowley's Book of the Law, this is the idea of you have Nuit followed by Hadit. Okay, Hadit being the active principle, more martial in his way, or maybe in the way that he behaves. And Nuit represents that infinite potential and possibility. And that's how they're represented. So we have this almost idea of Astarte as this representing this potential, whereas her sister might have been the more active principle in terms of that. But yeah, we don't know whether how much. Then there's the whole timeline of patriarchy thing. Like, when does that start? And are we assuming a patriarchal narrative? Should we necessarily assume a patriarchal narrative? I'm sure a lot of these cultures were in a lot of ways, but if you look at the writings of Ctesias, for example, he talks about some of the Babylonian queens, who first of all were much more badass fighters than many of the men. And there was one queen in particular, and I'm not remembering her name right now because it's been a few years since I've read those texts, but she was the queen, and she would always have the male, like the youngest and like the hottest male warriors like brought to her, and she would have sex with them and then she would kill them, which that just seems kind of a waste, but that's what she would do. And so she had this sort of this kind of fearsome reputation, and so you think about this idea, this female figure, this imposing ruling female figure who also has this power over even the more powerful male warriors. And she is as ruthless in the way that she behaves as what you might think of as a despotic king or something. But she's also not necessarily considered to be a bad ruler on that account. So I don't know. I mean, there are certainly other things in the Ctesias text, like when you have kings who are on the other hand more effeminate in the way that they behaved, including one who actually liked to dress as a woman. Then it was kind of seen like, well, then that's when you start reading texts that say like, oh well, that was unmanly, and he was going to be deposed because of that, because he was behaving into quote unquote effeminate of a way. So yeah, you do see the elements of that there. In terms of timeline, I don't know. And Ctesias, of course, is later and not necessarily a reliable historical source. But we do have these interesting ideas that come from these Mesopotamian cities about, you may see some of I think all of them, you see this traditional idea of femininity, which I have always likened back to the Greek idea of oikos, but it has its own version of that in other cultures. Obviously, it's the idea of the household, particularly of the tribal household or of the king's household. But it's this, you see all these creation myths that are centered around the presence of death, and death, of course, is seen to be a rather gloomy and not too nice affair. Even though, but it's not the same as going to hell. That implies a judgment. on somebody. The only places that you see associated with judgment after death is like the Greek Tartarus, and even that is very, very selective about who is punished there. It's not just, oh, you die and you were a bad person, you're going to Tartarus. Egyptian religion also, as we talked about last week, has a certain element of that judgment that they've had. But again, a lot of it may have to do with the structure of the society itself. When you have societies that are ruled by tribal kings, you don't have the idea of the family, the lineage of the family becomes very, very important. So the role of the female and her sexuality being like channeled towards that purpose. So yes, it is her job and her duty to have children, to not be having sex with other men, to not be, I mean, there's a thing associated with it because there's this importance of maintaining and carrying on the family line in the best possible way that we see. Of course, we also see a lot of incest and stuff in these houses, which is not good for it. But this idea of the household and as the woman as having this very important role in giving humans their only chance at something like immortality before immortality was a real idea. It even says it in the Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh is told, immortality the gods saved for themselves. Death comes to all humans. So I think when he's visiting the underworld, and he's a tavern woman that he meets in the underworld says to him, "Don't come here. Enjoy your life, because this is all going to go away. Immortal life the gods kept for themselves." So that idea is certainly there. This idea of us being immortal after death is a much later idea, but that is a definite sideline that I'm not going to jump into right now, but that I've discussed elsewhere, particularly in the lectures on, or the podcasts. I've also done lectures, but podcasts and things I've written on Dionysus. So that's the story that we have of her. We don't see her discussed in a whole lot of places. So I think I want to talk a little bit about Canaanite religion. So just looking at this, it says they're a group of Semitic religions practiced by Canaanites living in the Levant through at least the early Bronze Age, through the first centuries CE. So it's through. So we do see this being practiced for a very, very long time. We're talking at least a couple of thousand years when we look at this. And they say it was polytheistic and in some cases monolatristic. Monolatristic is a term that has to do with, it's actually kind of like henotheism. It's a similar term to henotheism, which is the idea that you have many gods, but there may be one that stands out more than others. Like even ancient Judaic religion followed this monolatristic, henotheistic kind of way, because Yahweh was like a favored deity among other deities that they worshipped. This is why when people get very confused reading about gods in the Old Testament and just assuming, oh, they must just be talking about angels all the time. Well, no. Sons of God, there's this almost idea of this subordination of other gods to Yahweh. But Yahweh is most definitely the main god, and eventually Yahweh is extremely jealous, which he literally says in the first commandment in book of Exodus, is that I shall have no other gods before me because I am a jealous God. That's what he literally says. He doesn't say there are no other gods. He just says he's jealous. So there's these Canaanite deities definitely played a huge role. So the hierarchy of Canaanite religion is headed by El and Asherah. And Asherah we'll talk about next week, or next couple weeks. But it was worshipped by, so there's a detailed listing. There's a god of the moon, Aglabol. He's part of a tree of gods of Palmyra, Syria, along with Bel and Yarhabul. Anat, who is, now she's a little bit more akin to Athena. We're going to talk about her too. Virgin goddess of war and strife. So that's almost like combining Athena's attributes with like those of Eris, which is really interesting. Arse, who's the goddess of the underworld, one of the three daughters of Baal Hadad. Arsu, the god of the evening star. Ashtar, Chemos, the wife of Chemos, and the goddess of the Moabites. Okay, I'm not going to read through all of these, but we have Asherah, we have a goddess of fate, we have Astarte, we have Atargatis, who's the wife of Hadad. She's a goddess of fertility as well. She's also got some really interesting iconography. Anyway, I don't want to read through this entire list. There's a lot here. So they have this huge pantheon of gods. Afterlife beliefs, in the cult of the dead, they believe that following physical death, and I'm not going to be able to say this word, it's spelled something like NPS with like an accent over the top, usually is translated as soul, departs from the body to the land of Mot, which is death. Interesting root there, mot, very similar to mortal or mort in that way. And again, linguistically, they may or may not be related, but it looks interesting, like an interesting connection there. Bodies buried with grave goods and offerings of food and drink were made to the dead to ensure they would not trouble the living. In this, they resemble all of their neighbors in the Near East. Dead relatives were venerated and sometimes asked for help. Now, this is interesting. This is their cosmology, the Canaanite cosmology. This one was reconstructed from a later Phoenician text by Philo. Actually, he had Philo of Byblos particularly. So, according to the pantheon known in Ugarit as Elohim, or the children of El, where have we seen that before? Supposedly obtained. The creator was known as Elion, who was the father of the divinities, and in the Greek sources, he was married to Beirut, which is like the city of Beirut. This marriage of the divinity with the city would seem to have biblical parallels with the stories of the link between Melkart and Tyre, Chemosh and Moab, Tanit and Baal Hamon in Carthage, and Yah in Jerusalem. And you do see that, by the way. I did a paper on this for AAR. That's probably 10 years ago now. But you do see this also. Jung talks about this a lot in his answer to Job. Yeah, you have this idea of the marriage to Israel. So while Israel is not just a city, or a physical place, it also represents a tribe. Although, as we see, their physical place is of something of great importance to the Jews, especially after the diaspora. The idea that they're not having their own land. That's all about the whole historical thing having to do with Israel. But Israel as the bride of the Lord. So interesting. We see where this comes from in the Canaanite, these Elohim. But an Elohim means children of El. We even see this in Genesis. That's the term that's used. And so when you see this term sons of God, that it's coming more from this. It's not about, these were a bunch of angels. Like, these are the sons of God. They're the children of El. And of course, that implies that there's a union. It says the union of Elion and his consort Asherah would be representation of primordial Kronos and Rhea in Greek mythology, or Roman Saturnus and Ops. Yeah. So Asherah, who we'll talk about next week, or next podcast. I always say next week. I don't know why. There's this idea that you have this idea of Yahweh as having a consort. Elion is definitely, he ends up being conflated with Yahweh. And eventually Asherah is banned, as we will see from the Bible, as from Israelite practice as well. So there's the whole mythology we talked about where Baal is challenged and defeats Yam and swallows Baal and so forth. And okay, as far as religious practices go, archaeological investigations at the site of Tel Es Safi have found the remains of donkeys as well as some sheep and goats in early Bronze Age layers, dating to 4,900 years ago, which were imported from Egypt in order to be sacrificed. One of the sacrificial animals, a complete donkey, was found beneath the foundations of a building, leading to speculation that this was a foundation deposit, something that you would do before you would build a house. They would sacrifice an animal to kind of ensure, as a protection or as an offering to the deity before building an actual structure. And it says it's virtually impossible, or considered virtually impossible, to reconstruct a clear picture of Canaanite religious practices. Although child sacrifice was known to surrounding peoples, there's no reference to it in ancient Phoenician or classical texts. The biblical representation of Canaanite religion is always negative. No kidding. Well, it's funny because Canaanite religion is literally what informs the Old Testament, but I have literally said many times, I said, if you wanted to condense to the 140 character version of what the Bible's about, the Old Testament is most certainly about either why the Jews felt they were losing in this continual war over territory, like why they felt they lost, and usually the reason was, we must have made Yahweh angry. It must be because we're adopting the ways of our neighbors. Let's get rid of more ways of our neighbors. And that's pretty much what the Old Testament is about. How the Israelites are establishing their own identity and their separation from their neighbors. So their neighbors, of course, neighbors' ways bad, our ways good. So that's what you see, and another reason that I tell people you can't look to Deuteronomy and Leviticus and things like that to take modern moralistic. You can't take your moral instruction from those, because it doesn't have anything to do with modern moral instruction. It has to do with a jealous storm god who, based on these other primary Canaanite deities, who's very temperamental. we tend to think of the Bible as having to do with Jesus and so on, but that's New Testament stuff. And the way that the beliefs of the Jews had changed by that point is fairly dramatic. There's a much greater separation that has gone on as there's been different influences. Zoroastrianism seems to be a notable one, although I have also written about how I'm not clear. A lot of people point to this period of time, Cyrus the Great. That's who I was thinking of. Cyrus the Great, because Cyrus is said to be the one, he's referred to in the Bible as the anointed one, like he's a Messiah figure. The reason being that Cyrus was considered that way was because he allowed the Jews to build and to keep their temple, even though he was the conqueror. So the idea was, Yahweh, put the thought in his head that we should be allowed to continue as we are. So he is celebrated. And a lot of people feel that Cyrus was influenced by Zoroastrianism. I think most notably there was a piece I remember reading by Mary Beard about that. But I don't feel the evidence is really strong that Cyrus was a Zoroastrian. Nonetheless, in spite of that, it's pretty clear that you're seeing the Zoroastrian influences by the time you get to the book of Isaiah and things like that. It's interesting. So just to finish this up, they were talking about through the Hellenistic period. It says in the non-Jewish parts of Palestine, Greek religion grew alongside pre-existing Canaanite traditions rather than replacing them. From the ancient Canaanite practice of outdoor worship, the Greek custom of worshiping Zeus on a simple altar or atop Mount Ida or Olympus cannot have appeared all that odd. The new masters conferred Greek names on the ancient Canaanite deities. Yes, the Greeks conferred their names on everything, and then later the Romans took the names of their deities and conferred them on Greek deities. So yeah, there's a lot of overlap there. Okay, so this is sort of the basics of Canaanite religion and the background that we have here. So as you can see, these deities are very much connected to the Bible. Okay, so speaking of, where does Astarte fit into the Bible? So with respect to the presence of Astarte in the Bible, particularly in Israel and Judah, it says, following the trend of the disappearance of the worship of Astarte in inland Palestine, the state-level cult of this goddess was absent from Israelite and Judahite records from an early date, and she seems to have become one of many former gods demoted to the status of entities and powers of blessing under the control of the Israelite national god Yahweh. As such, the plural form of Ashtarte's name, Ashtaroth, became used as a term for the goddess and for fertility, while her role as a deity of warfare was absorbed by Yahweh. Now, Ashtaroth, that by the way leads to where Astarte ends up at the end of all this, but we'll get there. The worship of Astarte might nevertheless have survived as a minor and popular, but not royal, cult among the Israelite population, with the practice of hunting for undomesticated animals to be sacrificed being restricted to the family and local shrines, but not at the state level. The influence of the Neo-Assyrian Ishtar later increased the influence of this cult within the Israelite religion, so that the Ishtar-influenced Israelite Ashtart might have been the same goddess referred to as the Queen of Heaven by the Judahite prophet Jeremiah. It says, the Bible claims that the Israelite king Solomon introduced the worship of the Phoenician Astarte, or called Ashtoreth, in his kingdom, though it is uncertain whether this claim rests on any historical basis or if it was made retroactively as a reaction against Phoenician religious imports. The cult of the Phoenician Astarte appears to nonetheless have enjoyed some level of royal support during later periods of the Israelite kingdom. So there's no evidence of a cult of Astarte in Moab or Edom. In the Philistines, the Hebrew Bible records that Philistines displayed the armor of the dead Israelite King Saul in their temple of Ashtaroth, due to her role as a goddess of war and as the consort of Baal. Taking the armor of the enemy, stripping and offering the armor to Astarte. And the inhabitants of the Philistine city-state of Ascalon worshipped Astarte and identified her with the Greek goddess Aphrodite Urania. Okay, Aphrodite Urania is a Platonic concept, if you've not heard of it, and he made a distinction between Aphrodite Urania and Aphrodite Pandemos. And Aphrodite Urania was a celestial Aphrodite. And in fact, there's a lot about Astarte that seems to connect her, there's a discussion of her as also a celestial goddess, hence Queen of Heaven, because heaven then has nothing to do with our concept of heaven and hell. Heavens mean the skies. It's Oranos, it's the sky. That's why the Urania also. She has to do with the stars. And in fact, Venus Lucifer, the morning star, is also connected to Astarte. So it says later interpretations. Okay, this is what's interesting. I was going to get to. In some Kabbalistic texts and in medieval and Renaissance occultism, for example, in the Book of Abramelin and the Mage, the name Ashtaroth was assigned to a male demon, bearing little resemblance to the figure known from antiquity. For the use of the Hebrew plural form Ashtaroth in this sense, so really one of the demon kings is considered to be is Ashtaroth. I mean, is this male demon. So you're saying, like, wait, how did she get from one point to the other? So we'll continue to look at that. I'm just looking at this other information here on Astarte in the Bible. It says, continued as a popular deity in the Levant and elsewhere. She was a significant obstacle to the acceptance of the god Yahweh in the kingdom of Israel. She was referred to as Ashtoreth in the biblical narrative and condemned as a false god by the prophets of Yahweh in 1st and 2nd Book of Kings, Jeremiah, and elsewhere. The Bible also references her by her epithet Queen of Heaven, which she inherited from Inanna and Ishtar, and makes clear how popular she was in a passage from the book of Jeremiah. It says, after Jeremiah has told people that Yahweh would destroy them unless they humble themselves, reject other gods, and worship him alone, the people reject his warnings, claiming their lives were better when they worshiped the goddess. So this is from Jeremiah 44, verses 15 to 18. Then all the men who knew their wives were burning incense to other gods, along with all the women who were present, said to Jeremiah, we will not listen to the message you have spoken to us in the name of the Lord. We will certainly do everything we said we would. We will burn incense to the Queen of Heaven, and will pour out our drink offerings to her just as we did, and our ancestors and our kings and our officials did in the towns of Judah and in the streets of Jerusalem. Oh, there you go. There's some information for you. At that time, we had plenty of food and were well off and suffered no harm. But ever since we stopped burning incense to the Queen of Heaven and pouring out drink offerings to her, we have had nothing and have been perishing by sword and famine. And Jeremiah tries to say, oh no, that's just because you're worshiping false gods and Yahweh's mad at you. So kind of an interesting, we're seeing here how there's this shift. And this is a shift that repeats throughout, maybe in Judaism at this point, certainly within their own community, but we also see this as a tactic used by Christianity. So, because when people would say, well, I've stopped worshiping my old gods and now my life is terrible, it was just like, oh, no, it's only terrible because you're being punished for what you did. You know, you weren't supposed to worship them. You're supposed to worship this one. This is you start to see this kind of idea that it's not that the cause and effect there is not that you had not that you stopped worshiping this particular deity, so now things went bad, so you should really go back to worshiping that particular deity. It's, oh no, you shouldn't have worshipped that deity in the first place, or we told you not to and you still did, so now you're going to suffer a punishment because of it. It's back to this idea of justice and judgment by the gods. And I find that interesting in an environment where if there's been pagan influence, well, obviously it's all pagan, right? But when you have this kind of influence, when you have a polytheistic influence is probably a better word than pagan here, there's less of an idea that you are being personally punished or persecuted by the gods. It's a tit-for-tat relationship. Like, yeah, we pour out the offerings and burn the incense to the Queen of Heaven, and so she gives us something in return. Since we've stopped giving things to her, now she's not giving back to us. But instead, there's this idea that you are that there's a different deity, but in worshiping this deity, you've offended another one. So that becomes a problem. And this is something you see mentioned a lot in the Iliad, when you have the opposing sides in the war making offerings to Athena or to Zeus or to Poseidon or to the different deities. And you'll see the deities' reaction, like, yes, they offered this garment and did this to Athena, but Athena was not moved. It's a matter of, you can make the offerings, but the god may or may not listen to you. And typically the attitude was if say the Trojans had made an offering to Athena and then the next day they got trounced, then they would say, well, I guess she likes them better or like their offering better. Like, there's no idea of personal about it. It's not even, I mean, the god may be personally entrenched against this particular group, but it's not so much about, it's not so much that idea, like, well, we have an idea about prayer, like, oh, I prayed for this and didn't get it. It's not the same way. I think the best illustration of what I'm trying to say here was in a book called Achilles in Vietnam, which I used to use in my Troy and the Trojan War class when I taught full terms of that. And there's Achilles in Vietnam, I mean, actually, if you read this book, just warning, it's a very racist book against Asian people because it's basically therapy sessions for Vietnam vets suffering from PTSD. And the author, Jonathan Shea, he uses the Iliad and in some cases the Odyssey as a tool for helping veterans, express and detail their post-traumatic stress due to particularly the Vietnam War. And one of the problems that Shea had noted was that you had a lot of people who enlisted to go to Vietnam who were Catholic. And they were told by the church that, this was when communism was the big evil in the world. And so if you go over there, what you're doing is fighting communism, so you're fighting God's war. God is on your side. And when they went to Vietnam and things didn't, that's a very weird war where a lot of battles were won, but the war ultimately was not. So what happens in that case is that they've gone into battle with their rosary beads or whatever, and they think that I'm doing God's work, so in the end I'm going to triumph because God's protecting me. But then when that doesn't happen, they either came to the conclusion of, well, God's abandoned me and hates me, or there is no God. It leads them to an actually very almost nihilistic and existential kind of conclusion that is absolutely soul-crushing for people who very firmly held that ideal. But that's the problem when you try to turn it into an idea of it's always a problem when you're trying to add some kind of morality to the mixed. Archaic religion doesn't normally add that kind of morality. Here we see it in this case that's almost it's being introduced that way. Instead of that tit-for-tat relationship with the forces of nature that are around you, these powerful forces that you celebrate and make offerings to, and then they if they're pleased with your offering, they will grant you something in return. But it becomes this whole thing of instead it's not about you're not suffering because you didn't make the offering. You're suffering because now you're being punished. So it's a whole different way of thinking about things. So let me talk a little bit about this comparison to Inanna and Ishtar. Certainly have their own iconography within the Gilgamesh and within these other texts that we have. Again, there's this idea of Queen of Heaven. But if we recall from the Gilgamesh, Ishtar is not... Well, actually, neither Inanna or Ishtar. Inanna makes her famous descent to visit her sister Ereshkigal in the underworld. I think that was literally my third podcast was about Ereshkigal. But she makes her descent into the underworld and has to strip off not only all her royal jewels, but also eventually her skin and everything. And she's hung up like a dead corpse until she's rescued and brought back up. But when she finds out that her husband, who hasn't mourned for her at all, and in fact is picked up with another woman, then she ends up saying, okay, well, she sends the demons of the underworld to take him in exchange, because she was pretty ticked off about that. We also see the way Ishtar behaves towards Gilgamesh when she reaches out to him, and he's just kind of no, you know what, I've heard your trouble. And so she doesn't get involved with him, and then she strikes back at him, and ultimately, some of her attempts fail, which his best friend ends up dying and going to the underworld, and that's when Gilgamesh tries to go to rescue him. Female deities are not necessarily all that nice in that context. You're not when we tend to think of love goddesses, we want to add this layer of they have to do with love and desire, so they're beautiful. There's this idea of femininity, and that is you can see it in male anima projections. At least culturally. I don't want to talk individually because every man is different. Or anybody, let's just say, who is attracted to men attracted to women, is whatever that projection is, whatever that archetypal soul projection is going to vary individual to individual. But there is this idea in Western culture about these ideas of femininity. So you usually have a couple of different types of women. So for instance, you have women who are either smart or attractive, right? There's that notion, which is not true, but there's a notion that if you're smart, then therefore you're not pretty. But if you're pretty, then that means you're kind of empty-headed and vacant. And again, this is all stereotyping. But you definitely have this idea about the woman who is considered to have, by some cultural standard, to be attractive, versus the woman who might consider to be smart, and therefore maybe not totally unappealing, but she's not appealing in the way that the love goddess is. And you do kind of see this represented in a certain way, especially in Homer and in certain writings. Aphrodite is portrayed as this kind of like fickle, certainly when she appears on the battlefield to rescue Aeneas in the Iliad, and then she gets cut, it's like she runs back like crying like to daddy, like, oh, I got hurt, and then he's just like, oh honey, you're not supposed to be on the battlefield. But Aphrodite does have actually a connection to war. I mean, she cheats with her husband. Her husband, by the way, who's the one who makes armor, he's Hephaestus. Who does she end up? But who's she sleeping with? Sleeping with Ares or Ares. She's sleeping with the god of war. Love is very much in bed with war. I mean, there's an attempt there to kind of separate the two out. You start to see that, but the two of them are very much wedded, and there's not this assumption that because they are these attractive or seductive females that they're therefore vacant and stupid and have to be carried around. They are warriors. They're strategists. They're leaders. They're queens. And if you tick them off, they will hurt you. It's not a case of, and one of the things I found, especially I think it's in the second full chapter of my book Death and the Maiden, as I was researching that, I just found it really interesting to go through a lot of these female figures from that era. I was focused mainly on the Greek gods, but if you look at the gods from that era, the female figures are very, very complex. You can't just say like, oh, well, Athena was a virgin and dealt with war, therefore she was very masculine, or even a goddess like Artemis, who is the counterpart of Diana. She's a goddess who hunts, and she's also a virgin. Both of them have the potential to mess you up if you mess with them, like kind of look with any god. But Aphrodite had a way of messing with people too. But you often will see the group of them, and even with Hera. Hera's the queen of the gods, right? She's this this regal figure, but she's also, I mean, she's nasty. I mean, her husband cheats on her. She goes after the women and the children, and she does horrible things. She drives people mad. She drives them to kill each other. I mean, again, there's a whole podcast on Hera. There's also one on Artemis that I've done, but they are so. These are not what, by the standards that we have now about femininity, or I should say the narratives that we unconsciously adopt about women and femininity, or that men have been fed about women and femininity and what's considered to be acceptable. The woman who's your wife versus the woman you just sleep around with, and how they tend to be archetypally almost two different things. It's a lot of these ideas. We look at those ideas, so we look back at something like this and we're confused. But let's if we think about the idea of these love goddesses, okay, and again, when we're talking Anna Ishtar, we're talking Astarte. She also had this role in Egypt as a war goddess specifically, and the wife of Set later, in much later times when her worship was brought over to Egypt. But we also have goddesses like Freya, for example, in the Norse, who is a love goddess also, but is also a warrior. I've written my book on the Morrigan, which should be coming out next year. One of the things I see repeatedly in things, not just articles, but just things written by, it could either be scholars or just people with an interest in the folklore or people from the pagan community, but they always write about the Morrigan, and there's some people who are just very, very put off by the idea of the Morrigan as a sexual being, or as having, it's like, oh no, she was definitely not sexual. I mean, she was a war goddess, and she was, and birds settling on corpses and so forth. I'm like, that doesn't, and my point is that doesn't mean she's not sexual. We want to separate those things out, because we think that very sexualized goddess in some way, to sexualize a war goddess is somehow to try to diminish her. That's because we have this modern view of sex as something, as that undesirable part of the feminine. I mean, I guess if a guy's horny, it's the desirable part, but it's treated that way, like, oh no, she's this serious war goddess, and therefore she wouldn't be involved with it, unless she's using it in some very negative way, like it could not be associated with fertility. But there's a fine line between sex and death. Maybe fine line's not the right way to put it, but some people will say like an orgasmic experience is like a little death, right? And if you astrologically, sex and death reside in the same house, the 8th house. There's this connection deep connection with sex, with life. So in a sense, you're almost saying it is kind of true, life and death, that they're connected. And sex is associated with the creation of life. I mean, it's also with pleasure. And we tend to forget that too. We think it's all because we have that biblical injunction about be fruitful and multiply. We think everything is just about that. And it's not. It's not just about that. It's also about the pleasure aspect, but it's the idea of the woman as being able to seduce a man. So a man who might be very strong and very capable can be brought to his knees by a woman that he's in love with. So there's that idea of the power that women have, the power of seduction. And certain people have it more than others, perhaps. There's people who have it in different ways. But that shouldn't mean that doesn't mean you want to separate it out and say that the woman who maybe isn't apparently seductive or sexualized doesn't necessarily have that kind of art or have that kind of charm. So, okay, I made another quick note, and this will probably be the last thing I talk about here. I think with these goddesses, we need to consider the reasons that people went to war, or maybe the reasons people still go to war. And if we're talking about goddesses of war, or goddesses of love and war, you have to think that when the people of that time frame went out to make war on others, it was either because it was a sovereignty thing. You're defending your territory. You have invaders coming in. And the invaders not only want your land, they want your stuff. And remember, too, among stuff, quote unquote, were women. Women were regarded as loot, okay, in these particular things. You see this mentioned, the idea of these women who were taken like as concubines for the great warriors. You have this idea for war, so you have this idea of, defending your territory. Now we talk more about going to war as something kind of an idealistic thing. Like we just discussed in the Vietnam example, when people say, well, this ideology of communism is an evil, so we must fight it by going to war. We go to war a lot in modern times because we are trying to preserve a Western capitalistic way of doing things, or in a lot of the cases in the Middle East, it's because, well, they have a lot of oil that we need, so we want to have control over who's in charge over there. There's definitely this element to it. But when we look at these ancient battles, a lot of times they're over resources, but not necessarily because we're dealing with people who are poor, but because people just want more stuff and they want more land. It's a power grabbing kind of a thing, and but people fought war. It's almost like a kind of a game, like a boundary setting game. So it's interesting though that we see these female goddesses caught up in the idea of war. But the fact that women themselves were often just regarded as loot or things to be traded. But also consider, like, if I think back to the beginning of the Iliad, what is the general reason given for the Trojan War? It's supposed to be fought over Helen, who's supposed to be the most beautiful woman in the world, who's abducted by Paris, or she goes off with him voluntarily. It all depends on which version you read. In any case, she is the wife of King Menelaus of Sparta. And because of her beauty, like, of course, all these men want to marry her. But what she ends up doing, they end up basically, once Menelaus is chosen as her husband, whether she chooses him or however it works, then they all have to swear an oath to uphold Menelaus's claim to Helen. Okay, and so when Paris steals her, that's why they all go to war. They're all going to war over a woman. Okay, and who possesses that woman? And the very first chapter, the very beginning, that first chapter of the Iliad is like near the end of the Trojan War. It doesn't represent the end of the war, but it's pretty far in. You're at least 10 years in at this point by the time you get to the Iliad. And the first chapter is about a fight between Agamemnon and Achilles, two of the generals, over a girl who is a spoil of war named Briseis. Her father comes with a ransom to try to bring her home. Agamemnon rejects it and then gets into a fight because the priest, her father's a priest of Apollo, so when he can't ransom his daughter, he goes to Apollo and says, "Help me." And so Apollo's like, "Okay," and Apollo helps him in the way that he usually does. He sends a plague. So then they're saying, "Okay, well, we have to undo this plague. Like, you need to accept that ransom and you need to return the girl." And there's this big fight, and then eventually, it's actually Chryseis is the woman who Agamemnon, and Briseis is the one who belongs to Achilles. And so what Agamemnon's like, well, fine, then I'm taking your concubine. So Achilles gets really mad because this is a real slap in the face and an insult to one of the great warriors. So he just says, fine, I'm not going to fight anymore. Screw you, and goes to his mother to make sure that the Achaean warriors, it's not really the Greeks, it's the Achaeans, the Achaean League, that they lose and lose bad until he is the wrong against him has been redressed. So yeah, but again, this is over a woman. This is over this concubine. This is Chryseis, and then there's a fight between Agamemnon and Achilles over Briseis. So it's really interesting to see how women are in the mix. Obviously, when we read these narratives that are written, the women are, aside from the gods, these women are more passive. We're not seeing the kind of warrior narratives that you might connect with Northern Europe, particularly not only the Norse pantheons, but you see it in the Celtic as well, where the women were they were just as vicious as the men. But probably everywhere the women could be as vicious as the men. It's just when there became this attempt to separate out these different aspects of femininity, and when you're trying to wed kind of the fertility aspect to the war aspect, war really on a more fundamental level, if we just think about the idea of war rather than specific wars or specific warfare, war is about conflict. It's about two things clashing with each other. And if we think about that with a storm metaphor, then you think about the fact that when a thunderstorm comes in, and that happens because hot and cold air crash into each other, then what comes out of that? I mean, you have these thunder and lightning, you have rain. It could be a very destructive storm, but afterwards the air is usually clear and cooler, or sometimes hotter, testament to New Jersey summers. But the idea is that the air, the idea is that it's a clearing, like the clash between these two is resolved through conflict. Other way you can resolve a resolution of opposites is through some alchemical process. And to a certain degree, that's what this is as well. When Carl Jung talks a lot about the syzygy and this marriage of the sun and the moon, if you will, this bringing together of fire and water, and this is also mentioned in some of the ancient texts as well about this alchemical idea of taking these things that seem so opposite to each other and finding a way for them to integrate or blend together. Then it's very interesting how we see these war goddesses who almost represent that clash, which can be a conflict, or it can be a merging that produces a third thing or a new thing. So interesting to think about with Astarte in particular. So the idea that she becomes the last thing is about Ashtaroth, the demon who is mentioned. Okay, so here's a little bit on that. By the Middle Ages, Astarte, like Baal, was associated with the Christian devil and transformed in medieval works on demonology into the male demon Ashtaroth, part of an evil trinity with Beelzebub, or Beelzebub, which is derived from Baal, and Lucifer. And Lucifer is also, by the way, a representation of the morning star. Lucifer may also be connected metaphorically to a Babylonian king, but anyway. Among certain Christian denominations in the present day, Ashtaroth continues to be understood in this same role, while Astarte is dismissed as an ancient false goddess whose clergy were defeated by the power of Yahweh. Modern neo-pagan and Wiccan adherents counter this claim and continue to venerate the goddess. But she, like the others, she's important enough that she ends up being demonized as Ashtaroth. And if I think about the qualities of Ashtaroth, I'm actually tempted to go over and grab my copy of the Goetia here and see where he appears. Probably near the front, because he's considered to be so you've got this Ashtaroth, okay, is listed as a duke, actually. Associated with Venus, associated with copper. Tarot card is the Three of Discs, 10 to 20 degrees of Capricorn, so first decan of Capricorn, December 31st through January the 9th. So the 29th spirit is Ashtaroth, mighty strong duke, in the form of an unhurtful angel riding on an infernal beast like a dragon. Well, that's actually weird. That's almost like reminiscent of the Whore of Babylon. and carrying his right hand a viper. But again, this is considered to be male. You must in no wise let him approach too near, lest he damage you by his noisome breath. Yeah, he's considered to have really bad breath. Wherefore the magician must hold the magical ring near his face, that will defend him. He gives true answers to things of past, present, and to come, and can discover all secrets, which is also something very much, aside from any demonology, is associated with the underworld and with the dead. He will declare wittingly how the spirits fell, if desired, and the reason of his own fall. He can make men wonderful and knowing all liberal sciences, and rules 40 legions of spirits. Okay, so we see Ashtaroth with this Venus association. So again, we have this love goddess association. There's this idea, of him being shown being, again, this idea. Remember, we talked about Astarte as riding a horse and chariot, and now we're seeing him riding the back of this beast, which again gives us more of a Whore of Babylon kind of feel to that particular image of Ashtaroth, at least that appears in the Goetia. So. Interesting. I'm sure the works of Jake Stratton Kent, I can't say I've researched it for this podcast, but I'm sure Jake has gone a much deeper dive into the symbolism of Ashtaroth in one of his volumes of Encyclopedia Goetica, so that might be worth researching for people who are interested in that connection. But that's all I'm going to talk about for now. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you once again to my patrons, who I thanked earlier in the episode. If you want to check out my work, please check out Chthonia.net. That is my website. My Patreon is at patreon.com/Chthonia. You can find me on social media, Chthonia Podcast, one word on Twitter and Instagram, 2 words on Facebook. And if you're not watching this on YouTube, it's just Chthonia on YouTube, although it looks like they may have changed it to Chthonia Podcast when I changed my handle. But that's where you can find me there. And until the next episode, thanks for listening.